Man, I almost forgot to turn the audio on. And we are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicinda. I'm Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP, which is a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard, and skincare alchemy in the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire here at Plus One is to help amazing designers find great players who can love their games, and amazing players find great designers whose games they can love. We do that in a lot of different ways, but one of my favorite ways is actually sitting down with designers and creators to talk about their creative process and different things in the work that they're doing right now as part of our Prestige class series. And today we have exactly that happening. We are sitting down with the creative team from the new Citizen Sleeper tabletop role-playing game. Citizen Sleeper has been out as an RPG or video game for a while, but we're going to talk about the new solo version of the game that's crowdfunding right now over on the Lost in Cult site. I'm going to get the link up in the chat in just 1 second for you to be able to go check that out. But it's also linked in the description if you want to go see it right now. Let's meet that creative team. Not new on the stream, but first time on Prestige class and first time I'm getting to interview. We've got somebody whose work I'm a huge fan of for a while, and that's Alfred Valley. Alfred, why don't you tell people a little about who you are, what you do, and what your role is in Citizen Sleeper?
Yeah, so I'm Alfred Valley of the House of Valley. I'm a tabletop game designer based in London, tinkering around with all sorts of things, but especially solo RPGs. And for Citizen Sleeper, it's sort of direct collaboration with Gareth here. We'll continue to work on this nice, new, shiny sort of tabletop version of the very popular video game.
Awesome. Very excited to kind of dive in a little bit more with you. Just a little bit, always excited to have you here back on stream. One of my favorite people to get to collaborate with, and love the way you think. I'm looking forward to working on some more stuff with you in the future and talking about this project. First time on the stream, though, we've got Gareth. Gareth, why don't you tell people, same thing, who you are, what you do, and what is your role in Citizen Sleeper?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Gareth Damian Martin. I am a game developer and designer. I work as the studio Jump Over the Age. So you might know me from a previous video game known as In Other Waters, and then also from Citizen Sleeper, which came out last year and is a kind of Blades in the Dark tabletop inspired video game that brings a kind of a few ideas like clocks and some other things, has dice in it, from tabletop games to video games in a way that maybe hasn't been done, I don't know, or hasn't been done very often. And now, based off the back of that, I'm working on Cycles of the Eye with Alfred, which is the tabletop adaptation, the solo tabletop adaptation. And my role on that, I don't know, is to annoy Alfred by telling him bits of design and then saying, could you try and put that together to make that make sense for me, please? And then Alfred has to go away and make it work. But yeah, it's fun. It's been very fun to to work on solo stuff. And I'm also a big fan of Alfred. That's how I ended up contacting him to work on this and all of his solo work. So yeah. It's been fun.
When you and first reached out about kind of getting on and talking about having y'all on for an interview, mentioned this also cursedly uttered Alfred's secret name, which I already knew, but
The forbidden lore.
What are you
forbidden
talking
lore.
about? I've never heard of
but I was like, oh man, like absolutely, I'm sold. Like I was already very excited by the pictures and the concept and everything else, but knowing Alfred was working on it, looking at the work and the design and all the other elements that were going in, like this is something that I was immediately excited about. I'm also a huge fan of minimalist design with maximalist like presentation, and the RPG and the art book and everything else that y'all are hitting for this project are exactly what I love to see. But Garrett, let's start with you right there. You know, we usually start with just kind of talking to people about, you know, how you got into RPGs. For this conversation today, we're going to be exploring a little bit about the intersection between how video games, RPGs influence each other, specifically in the lens of y'all's project. Like, we don't have to talk about everyone else's projects, but if we have other ideas and want to go other places, we can. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started with RPGs, whether that's video games, tabletop, whatever makes the most sense. Also, hello to Ray in the chat, Dean in the chat, and Christian Real Meat Castle, who has been very excited to tune into this conversation, I know. So, Gareth, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started playing role-playing games?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it kind of all glues together because I was working on my first video game in Other Waters, and during that kind of, I'm mostly a solo developer, so I have a composer who does the music and sound for my games, and for Citizen Sleep I had a character artist, but mostly it's just me. So I was working on In Other Waters, making that, and in the daytime I was kind of working hard in Unity, like, and when you're making a video game, when you make narrative, you have to kind of like plan every individual thing down to the last detail. And if you want something to happen, you've got to build the system that makes it happen. And then in the evenings, I started listening to some actual play podcasts that I'd seen bouncing around. And I started thinking like, wow, these guys have it so easy because they just have a system, and then all the narratives grow out of that system, and they never need to build the system themselves. They just have like a few simple rules, and so many exciting and interesting things can happen here. And so after kind of listening to enough actual play, I was like, okay, I'm sick of listening to this. I need to start running this myself. So I bought a copy of Blades of the Dark and convinced my little brother to let me run a game for him. So I spent a lot of my DMing in kind of the beginning actually running games for just one player, because I don't know that many people who like RPGs, which is a whole other thing, kind of like a hybrid between solo RPG and like party RPG. But yeah, so that was, I kind of had this thing going on in my head where I was like, well, there's got to be a way to bring these two things close together. There's got to be a way to make a video game where it doesn't feel like you're kind of like carving every word of the narrative into a piece of rock day after day in order to tell people a story, where you can kind of have things be surprising or inventive, and you can make use of more abstract systems rather than having to build very specific systems for every single little thing. So when it came to making my next game, that was kind of one of my objectives. There was a few other things I wanted to do with Citizen Sleeper. It's a very kind of personal story about what it means to deal with depression, to deal with kind of like having to get up each morning and not knowing where you're going to make your money, not knowing how you're going to live your life, not knowing how much energy you're going to have. And that's kind of how the dice, work in the game. But part of it was me thinking, like, I can see all of these fascinating mechanics and stuff like Blades in the Dark. I can see all this incredible work being done. And yet it feels like video games have just got their eyes fixed on original or Dungeons and Dragons, or maybe 5e Dungeons and Dragons, but they're just kind of obsessed with it. And so I was like, what happens if we take some of these ideas from contemporary tabletop games, from Powered by the Apocalypse games, from Blades in the Dark, and bring them into a video game? And what I found was, yeah, it really can work. The game's had a huge audience and a huge response to it, and it's been a fascinating process. But yeah, so that was kind of my entry point into tabletop games. They were always in my mind something that just I immediately got excited by, and hadn't really spent that much time with before being a game developer, which for me is in my 30s. So it was kind of like a sudden arrival into the world of tabletop games, and just being like, oh my god, what happened to these things. The last time I remember these existing, it was D&D when I was a kid, and it seemed too nerdy for me. So I was like, okay, this is a whole new thing.
When did RPGs get cool?
Yeah, really. I was like, what happened? When did all this stuff become cool? Or maybe I became uncool, who knows? But either way, it was very exciting for me, and that's kind of what gave me the enthusiasm to make Citizen Sleeper.
Awesome. And picking up Blades and that being your entry point into the game and being like, hey, I'm just going to run this, because notoriously, like, you had the actual plays to guide you, but I also would posit Blades is like a game that John Harper, who wrote it, runs in a way that almost no one else runs the game, especially on an AP where you're going to be plotting and give it the time and the narrative space, which the game does very well, but in very different ways. So I'm super excited to see it. I'm really excited to hear about some of the integrations you did in the video game, and then kind of how Alfred's kind of pulling some of those out. But Ray's in the chat, and other people are in the chat loving the commentary. Ray says, when I first played Citizen Sleeper, I was so impressed with the indie ttrpg feeling of it. So that design goal certainly came across to folks. And then, man, I just realized I use people's real world names a lot of the time because I know them as real people, and other people are like, who said that? In the chat, Sword Queen Games said that in the chat. Alfred, how about you? Tell us a little bit about how you got involved with RPGs yourself.
Yeah, so in adulthood, I sort of rediscovered Dungeons and Dragons. Probably sort of was aware of its sort of cultural impact when I was a kid, but it was only when I was an adult I sort of really understood it and actually played it. And I think after that interaction, normally the normal course is to sort of dive headfirst into that, into 5e and all that stuff. My reaction was to go, well, this is pretty cool. What's the most extreme opposite of this? And so it led me to looking at micro games, which in turn reminded me of a lot of the sort of Fluxus art I'd enjoyed in the past. And so the way I started to approach game design was from like 5e on one side, and then like lyric games on the other side. And then I like to think what I make is some weird thing in the middle. And a lot of that was informed by board games, because I'm a big fan of board games, and that was sort of I guess originally into the whole RPG space. But I like to joke that my origin story as a ttrpg designer is that I'm a failed board game designer. So I found it too hard, came to RPGs, and have ever since been trying to incorporate mechanics from board games into role-playing games.
Yeah. Which, is a big passion point for us here on Plus One. Like, we love the way board games folk think about product design, different formats, other stuff like that. We are always really excited to see the kind of meshing between those two things. And again, video games oftentimes gets kind of talked about within that same breath. It's very interesting how we all love to sit down and play in imaginary spaces, but we love to do them with different types of ways that space is bound or presented, or other things like that, whether it's video games where it is tracking through and exploring different narrative pieces, sometimes with open world feel, sometimes not. And board games where it's like, hey, there's not necessarily a narrative happening here, but we have bound the space with some very specific abstracted mechanics and are asking you to just enter into those, which some people do willingly, and that not everybody who loves one will love the others. And there's even some stuff with like Through the Void, like we use very stricted like inventory slots for what people have on them. People were like, oh, that feels too much like a video game. I'm like, I don't have a problem with that, because immediately people who have played a video game know what's happening by the information design. It lets things live in a very cool space. So I'm really excited to talk to y'all within this process of again, like what it looks like for those things to kind of come around and influence each other. And I'm very excited to throw board games into that mix as it comes up or makes sense also too. So Gareth, let's just kind of start there. Like when you were designing the original game, Citizen Sleeper, like you said, Blades influenced this. You wanted to incorporate some of those roles, the feels you were looking for, and some of the things you wanted to bring in. For somebody who's never played the game before, what are some of the things that you instituted, and what does that kind of look like in play?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things that kind of I could pull across that was like, okay, this is really powerful and cool. I can just kind of take this and use it. And there were other things that was like, this doesn't work in a video game at all. I have to reinvent this totally. And so, for example, I would say like clocks are a massive central part of Citizen Sleeper. And clocks, as far as I'm aware, lots of people tell me that they use clocks in, or they find it weird to use clocks in tabletop games, or like they struggle with them. But I personally found them very natural when I first started running Blades, as just a way of abstracting literally any possible thing into some kind of mechanical system. So I use them when I'm running Blades. I use them for everything from, you know, like kind of long-term project. I love the fact you use them for like long-term projects, or you might use them for like a health bar, or you might use them to track how likely it is that, you know, the progress of a convoy along a road can be tracked by a clock. But equally, someone's psychological state can be tracked by a clock. And this was the thing that was a real kind of like brain exploding moment for me when I was running Blades, because it's quite video gamey, right? Like everything in a video game is just tracked by a number going up and down. But games are so obsessed with keeping that as far away as possible from the player and hiding that away behind animation and simulation. And so one of the things I did in Citizen Sleeper is like, well, what if we just played it like an RPG? What if everything in the game, everything you're working towards, every threat that might come and strike you is a clock? And that's one of the things I do in the game. And one of my favorite techniques, which is something I do really early on in Citizen Sleeper, is I stick a clock on your home base in that game, and it says hunted, and it ticks up every cycle. So it ticks up one every turn, and it's unclear who's hunting you, but you know you're being hunted. And something I love to do with my players in Blades is just give them a clock with 3 question marks next to it, and just occasionally tick it up just to keep them guessing. So I was just that was something that I was just like, okay, this just worked. Like this works. I'm having fun. But you know, one of the main things, obviously, in Blades or in just tabletop games generally, is dice rolls. And I think video games are incredibly bad at handling dice rolls because people don't accept randomness in video games in the way they would in a tabletop game. And so if you just say to somebody, hey, try and do something, and they're like, oh, sorry, you didn't do it, that's kind of like that's an immediate recipe towards rage and anger and upset in a player in a video game. And so part of what I wanted to explore in Citizen Sleeper was, as I said before, this kind of the story of like what it feels like to live at the edge of where society is functioning. And part of that is kind of like, what do you do each day? What are the decisions you make each day? And having to deal with chance or luck, or being exposed to luck because you're in a difficult position. And so quickly, the idea of a hand of dice that you roll at the start of a turn and then assign to different actions was something that felt like it solved 2 problems for me. One, it kind of represented the idea of kind of a limited amount of energy that you have each day that can be random. So it can range from 5 6s to 5 1s. And that kind of shapes, you know, conceptually in your mind, it kind of shapes like what kind of day you're having. But it also solves the problem of not having a dice roll just kind of slap you in the face and say like, no, sorry, you can't go through that door. Because even though the game uses those dice to randomly give you outcomes, so like a 6 has a better chance of a good outcome than a 1 does, because the player is choosing which resources to invest in which action, they generally feel okay about the possible outcomes, because they're like, well, I'm putting a 6 on this and that's a guaranteed success, while I'm putting a 1 on this, which means I'm really just leaving myself open to chance, like I'm risking it. And so it allows that kind of level of expression, which I think is, you know, again, that's me translating it. But I think Blades, one of the things that really impressed me about that system is the way that it allows the player to invest in a single action. You know, you can dump your stress to get an extra dice. You can go for the devil's bargain with the DM to get yourself like 1 more dice. You can really like go, okay, I really want this to happen. I'm going to stack everything in this corner. And I really like that in Blades because it feels like there's that kind of interesting tug of war that goes on. So I think those are kind of the 2 core things, the clocks and this kind of like hand of dice that I really tried to pull across from Blades. There's lots of kind of smaller stuff, like having 3 outcomes. So like having a kind of neutral success, a positive success, and then like or what I call like a boon success, and then like a fail. And so having that expressive range is also more similar to Blades, and also preemptively telling the player by saying like risky, controlled, or danger, what kind of action they're going to undertake. So to preempting that risk, so the player knows very clearly, okay, this, if I put my dice here, you know, I could be in trouble. So again, like trying to bring that information to the front, put it in front of the player, and use those abstract systems to tell a story, I think was something that it was really important to me.
And chat's going at it, but yeah, 100%. Like there is a huge element of like agency that you're talking about, right? Like it's okay, it's easy to deal with frustration when I know that I have some level of control and I know it's not blindly just like, hey, the plot or the limits of the programming just won't let me do this thing, right? When you know, like, hey, I've rolled badly, but I can choose where those hard things are going to hit, is huge. It's not just saying, hey, yeah, you failed to do this, what's next, or roll again in RPGs is like the worst thing. And so having player agency and making things player facing, like I remember GURPS was my entry into the system, so like there's this great back and forth love story with Fallout and GURPS that never, they've never quite made it happen in the will they won't they of that conversation, but there's tons of influence back and forth between how perks work and other elements like that really drive that home. And I also remember at one point in Knights of the Old Republic, when I was playing it like pretty steadily, you could just turn on all the math behind the scenes. Like you could literally see the dice rolls happening and the modifiers coming across for every single action you took at the bottom of the screen. If you wanted to see those, that math happening behind the scenes and know what essentially the dice rolls were. I love seeing some of those different pieces. And I also just love like kind of hearing you talk about how you brought those things in and why they mattered so much to you, which I'm sure has made it really easy for Alfred to just hack all that stuff into a Blades in the Dark hack and make this game just fly off, right, Alfred?
Well, that's the funny thing. I haven't played Blades in the Dark, so I've played Blades in the Dark one step removed, and sort of trying to unpick something that is informed by it, but arrive at a different destination, if you will. Yeah. But certainly things like the cycle dice, like Gareth mentioned, just from the start seemed so essential to have that set of 5 dice that you roll and have that, because it's such an iconic thing. It's not just to do with the mechanics of it, it's just the fact that you see it at the top of your screen. It is that thing that you sort of associate with your playthrough of the game that made it so essential for us to recreate that. Albeit the mechanics around how that affects how you attempt challenges is different by necessity, because it isn't a video game. It's still sort of just completely core to what we're working on and what we've made so far.
Now, so talk to me a little bit about what it's like. So you have this this video game that has been heavily influenced by Blades, this RPG like you talked about, and now you're taking that and you're moving into Cycles with the Eye, which is a solo RPG, something you do especially well. Tell me a little bit about what that's going to look like. Like we have some information on the page, but we also know like there's a tarot deck that y'all are incorporating. There's the core dice roll. What are some of the things that people can kind of expect from the translation into an actual solo RPG?
Yeah, well, this is very much a tarot sort of based game, which is interesting for me. It's the first time I've worked with tarot cards. It's given me the opportunity I've been looking for to finally splurge and buy myself a tarot deck. So the game very much is finding a way mechanically to give that sort of hit of the CitizenSleeper experience, but in a way that, when wrapped up in the context of tarot, means you can sort of follow your own path through that world that Gareth has expertly created so far. So that the game, I don't know, it's funny. It's taken, as you say, it's taken something that's based on a ttrpg and then try and translate it back again. But it's not quite as straightforward as that. It's not like we're trying to go backwards to Blades in the Dark. We're now taking the CitizenSleeper and going somewhere else. So I think from my experience, when I first came on the project, a lot of what we both worked on is just trying to nail the physicality of it, the mechanics of how it works, with the knowledge that all the stuff that you get from tarot, the wonderful sort of juxtaposition of meanings and the sort of significance you can draw from cards, comes later, and all of that can be informed by the amazing sort of storytelling experience that CitizenSleeper has already set up. But yeah, so a lot of our work in the run up to the Lost and Cold sort of crowdfunding was to prove to ourselves that something could work. Can we make this? Can it actually do the job it needs to do? And of course, we're pretty confident we've reached that point. But so just to say that it's a weird sort of mixture of something that I describe as being quite gamey, like you could, as I think Gareth has described it before, you could use it as a sort of almost quite mindful solitary experience and just get lost in the sort of mechanics of the thing. Or there's the sort of other end of the spectrum where you can engage yourself, you can be headfirst in the whole element of sort of meaning making and leaning into the tarot experience and trying to narrativize your experience with the game. So it's quite interesting how it sort of caters for both sides of that coin, and how you can sort of get out as much as you want to put into it.
Awesome. And what did the collaboration process start with for the two of y'all? Like, did y'all was it like, hey, Alfred, log 100 hours on this game, come back with an RPG concept? What did it look like as y'all kind of entered into the conversation around how the partnership and the collaboration was going to work?
Well, it was amazing. It was around Christmas time. I treated myself to Citizen Sleeper on my Nintendo Switch, and then about a month later, Gareth slid into my DMs saying they had a proposition for me, and it just really went from there. Gareth has been very supportive and complimentary of my work in the ttrpg space, and yeah, I just from my point of view at the start of the process, it felt like I'd want a golden ticket. And it's what I mean, even then it felt good, but like, you don't entirely realize the sort of scale of something like this until you see it through the eyes of an audience or the public. And so seeing all the reception to it in terms of when the crowdfunding started, it's just sort of blew my mind a little bit, especially blew off my notifications on my phone.
Gareth, from your perspective, what are some of the big elements?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because yeah, I'm a huge fan of Alfred's work, and I think for me it was like just looking, in a way, I've been looking for an excuse to like slide into Alfred's DMs for a long time, just kind of be like to just have something been saving up something to just kind of come in and say like, hey, let's work together. And this just kind of came together, but it did kind of come with the proviso of like, I wanted to use tarot and I wanted to use dice. And so tarot's been that kind of interesting thing that I had in my head, like, okay, I really want to do a tarot set for Citizen Sleeper, and I really want to use tarot. And I've been getting really into tarot as a storytelling mechanism. And so I think that was kind of the thing that I kind of threw at Alfred and said like, yeah, tarot, like, how do we make it work? But what has been really fun has been turning tarot. I think we're doing something quite distinct in turning tarot into an oracle, and also a kind of your kind of GM in the game. It handles that side of the game, or at least it collaborates with you. And that has been really fun and exciting to kind of figure out, because I think the oracle systems that Alfred uses is one of the things that I really love about Alfred's work, that kind of like that sense of openness of providing prompts, and the kind of delicate balance of how you make a solo game that is not overly prescriptive, but is also like mechanically actually quite satisfying and chunky. And so that's why I was like, okay, Alfred's the right person, because that's where Citizen Sleeper needs to be. We need to have this quite video gamey, like, some of it's obvious, right? You need to roll 5 dice every turn, and you need to assign those dice to challenges like that makes itself, and that kind of is easy. But then how you then use the tarot deck to set up those challenges, and then I really wanted to kind of like have somebody pull the game out of my grip, like feel it leaving my fingers, because I'm like holding on to it and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, it has to be like this, and it has to be like this, and it has to be like this. But actually what I really want is to give something to players that they can really invest in, because I think that's where I personally, as a DM, like as a GM, I run games and I like to just make stuff up on the fly. I hate to have to go to the source book and find a creature. I would just invent a creature. And so I don't want my versions, my RPG things, to feel like I'm leaning over people's shoulders saying like, here's the lore, like, no, go look in the book. So that's why I think it's really helpful to have Alfred in there as well, to like pull that stuff away from me and kind of open it up to the player. And we've kind of we're ending up making almost like this beginner's tarot deck where in a slight, some people are probably horrified by this, but like where we're actually printing words on the tarot cards that kind of sum up the reversed and upright meanings of the tarot card into a single word, which is like a weird thing to do with tarot because the point is you're supposed to interpret it. But in the same sense, we need it to act as a kind of like quick to use oracle or a thing that inspires the story. So that there's a really interesting thing happening there. Which I think is quite cool. Alfred has also invented a deeply cursed object, which I have in my hands here, which is a clock dice, which I didn't think we'd necessarily. I thought we might write down clocks on bits of paper, but we kind of came up with this thing as like a way of tracking progression that you can like. Okay, it's easy. You turn the dice and you count up and down from 6. And if you played something like A Quiet Year, you'd be familiar with using a dice to track a project as a little marker. But what's fun about a clock dice is you can also roll it, and then what number it starts on can then be like the clock that's running. And that's a very exciting thing that we're messing around with now as potentially an aspect. And so, yeah, there's some weird stuff coming through that's quite fun. I feel like a clock dice is something I want to use as a GM to just roll it occasionally.
100%. Like I'm immediately like, that is entirely unnecessary, and I love it, and I want it on my table right away. The chat is reflecting that also too. Need to sell those on the side to Blades players. Somebody saw the dice in the header and they love that idea. Sword Queen says, I would love to have a clock die for my Blade / Forge in the Dark games. Yeah, I mean, again, you can just count it down, but that visualization and that crossover is such a great idea. And even as a non-dice goblin, I'm like, I immediately want a pair of those. So no, I love that. And again, I think some of that comes from that board game influence also that we were talking about earlier. Like people think about physical and form factor a lot when you're thinking about board games. Like these are dice, but what else can they be? Or how are we presenting them in a way that lets them do the thing they do? Plus more is such a huge aspect to the table presentation for all of this, along with like things like laying out a tableau from the deck and other things like that. We had a really good question come through from Real Meat Castle. Was the game something you all started working on before the Design Works book, or was it envisioned as part of like the total overall project?
Yeah, so it's a funny 50-50 one where I started on the Design Works book with Lost in Color, and at the same time I've been thinking about wanting to do a tabletop game, and I'd kind of like thought, okay, maybe in future I'll do like a kind of full Forged in the Dark version, but I want to kind of baby step my way there. And I had done Tidebreak, which is like a yet to be finished. We're just about to finish it, but it's a Mothership module based on In Other Waters, my first game, and I'd done that with Lone Archivist. And that was kind of my first step making stuff. I was like, okay, a solo RPG would be great to make next. And so I'd kind of got it in my head. And then one day I was talking to Lost in Cult, and they were like, oh, it would be really cool to have the dice from the game in with the book as just a kind of extra fun thing. And as something in me was like, there's something very wrong with including dice but not a game. And so that started me down a path of thinking where I was just like, well, if we're having dice, we have to have a game. And then I also started thinking about the character art and how nice the tarot set would be. And I was like, well, I kind of dice and tarot. And then what? You're just supposed to use them to play something normal? No, like that's half the work done. So let's keep going down that path. And so then I was like, okay, let's get Alfred involved and let's keep going in that direction. And then it just kind of like has taken on a life of its own where I had kind of thought of something relatively modest, but at a certain point I went to Lost in Cult and I said to them, look, you're a tabletop publisher now. I'm sorry, but I've done it. This thing has to have a separate page. It has its own name. It has its own branding. Like this is not a pack-in. This is its own thing. And so I've kind of Trojan horsed Lost in Cult into publishing tabletop games, which I hope they continue to do.
Yeah, now they've got twice as many dice
yeah. Yeah, and I wasn't familiar with Lost in Cult that they reached out, but like the art object factor of all of their publications, the way that they pursue their work, such a great group to partner with that really understands the fusion between like, hey, like we're talking about video game culture, but we want to create this beautiful physical object that helps manifest that you want to have on your table, that you want to have as a conversation piece. Was totally blown away by the work that they do, and was really excited to kind of see them step into this space, because I do think they want to. I'm also glad you mentioned In Other Waters, because people in the chat have been asking about it also too. Like I hope we can get part that in as part of the conversation, so we will come back a little bit later to some of that, because I do think there are some folks watching who want to know a little bit more about that project, and I think Alfred will bear with a little bit of mothership dialogue in the middle of that also too, as well. But no, I've loved getting to kind of see and just kind of look through some of the different visual elements, which I'm popping up on the screen right now to look at it. You kind of mentioned this, the kind of trying to work on the tarot deck having kind of this beginner's element to it, helping people learn how to use that story. And I actually, like, from a, like, you know, as somebody who doesn't have any particular attachment to tarot, like from a game design and an onboarding standpoint, we are constantly talking to people about how do you make it easier for people to play your game. And it's something that a lot of people would be like, oh, that's just not a thing you do with tarot, so we're not gonna work it into the system, because that's, you know, that's counter to the point. I love that understanding. And you said you're trying to fuse it into one word, so it's one word that represents both the upright and reverse position, or is it two different words, one for each?
So I have some monstrosities with me that I was doing a playtest with, which are tarot cards with words scrawled on them. So basically we have one on one side and one on the other. So obviously in the beautiful cards, they don't look like this, but yeah, so because tarot cards have like
hold it back up for a second so people can see it, because I was moving things around on the screen.
There you go. I mean, that's a really ugly one.
That's all right.
But these are just Rider-Waite classics. But I scrawled them on them so I can do playtesting.
Yeah,
but there's actually, so basically we just have, you know, if you hold the card up, you read, it's easier to read the word on one side, and then if it's upside down, it's easier to read the word on the other. But the way we use them is actually we use some tarot cards in the game on their sides, so that you can read those words, and that's kind of your choice. So when you what was until very recently introduce a location, but now may become a drive based on playtesting. But when you introduce a new challenge, you kind of look at the card and you introduce it either this way up or this way up. And that defines like what word it is that you're associating with here. So I've got like self-sufficiency versus unreachable is the other word. It's sometimes tarot meanings are very hard to squish into a single word. But so you might interpret that as like, well, self-sufficiency for my sleeper means working towards getting a source of the stabilizer they need to survive. So, okay, that's what that challenge represents. Or like unreachable might be, oh, well, this challenge represents the fact that the sleeper is trying to make themselves unreachable for the people hunting them down. So they're trying to find a place where they can be unreachable. You know, that's the kind of narrativization that we're trying to encourage in the player. And then under that, you deal a series of tarot cards, which actually are just represent kind of numerical challenges. So you're then assigning dice to beat those based on the number on the card. So tarot cards kind of have a double use in that way.
Love it. And then last but not least for the project, I want to know more about the vinyl, because we're a sucker for a piece of analog or outdated music technology in a game. And so I own 3 record players now, because I got one so I could play records connected to my computer, of course, because I want to include them on stream for when new things come out or games and other stuff like that. And then my kids stole one, and then my kids stole another one. And so now I have a 3rd record player, and each of my children have one in their room also too. So tell us about the vinyl.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The reason that I got really into vinyl was when we were working on doing a vinyl release of the In Other Waters soundtrack. And I got a test pressing through, and I was like, I guess I have to buy a record player because I have to listen to this thing. And so I bought a record player, and then I bought a couple of records, and I was just kind of amazed by there's something about the length of a side of a record combined with the art, combined with the beanbag that I just acquired, that just meant that I sat there and just listened to music without doing anything else in a way that I hadn't done in years. And so I was just immediately sold. So since then, I've been very, very excited about working on vinyl projects, and so this time round, we just kind of the vinyl is just, I mean, it's a gorgeous soundtrack by Amos Roddy, and then the main concept behind it is to try and have this like cell animation style effect in the packaging, where you basically have the background of the key art and then you have the kind of foreground elements printed on a plastic sleeve, so it kind of looks like you've got a classic Japanese animation cell on there, which is it's just me kind of trying to nod to a lot of the anime influences that the game has. So that's really nice. Unfortunately, the magenta version is now sold out, but there's going to be other versions coming out with Stumpy Frog, who's doing the vinyl. Basically, for this whole project, I just bullied a load of people into doing this all on the game's anniversary, because I was very excited about doing a massive event for the game's anniversary. So I was talking to Stumpy Frog and saying like, hey, let's do the record. And I was talking to Lost in Cult and saying, hey, let's do the book at RPG. And I was talking to my publisher and saying like, hey, let's do some announcements. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to make all of you do this in the same week. So that's been fun and a bit crazy. I don't know if I would do that again. It was still ambitious.
I was going to say, you probably bore the brunt of that more than anyone, right?
I really truly reaped what I sowed there. That was the situation. But yeah, so the vinyl is just one part of that. But it's and in the very special anniversary edition, we do have a slip mat as well with some art from the game, which is my new obsession, is slip mats, which is there's so many wonderful ones out there. So yeah.
Awesome. Sweet. One other thing I'd love to just kind of pull out at the end, maybe we'll talk about in other waters as for the last little beat is Gareth, for you, like, what's something you think that video game creators like should really consider when it comes to the world of like RPG, like tabletop RPGs? Like, what's something they should be doing, thinking about, like looking at, considering, that comes with the medium of RPGs that you would love to see more people translated into their games? I know you talked about some of that at the beginning, but if you had one piece of like salient advice, would love to hear it. And then Alfred, same for you, but in reverse. Like, right, what's one piece of what's one of the realities of the video game medium, that creative process that you've really valued kind of as you've been approaching the solo RPG for this in collaboration with Gareth? I'd love to hear kind of from each of you. Maybe, and it could be if you have more than one idea or more than one thought, want to elucidate for a while, that's great. If you just got here's the one thing, that's wonderful also too. We'll hit some other questions and talk about in other waters and call it an interview. But Gareth, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, seeing as I kind of touched on it before, but I just really would emphasize like abstraction, I think, is the thing that I find really interesting. I found it very interesting that Baldur's Gate 3 has got like D20s appearing on the screen. There's like something funny about watching that come around again. And I think that's kind of, now that video games, I don't know, maybe they haven't, but I feel like video games are getting to a point where there's kind of like, we can only go so far down a kind of simulationist like perspective until we realize like, oh, we're not going to ever get there. It's a continually receding goal, and it's getting more and more expensive and harder to do because things have to be, you have to reach high fidelity. So I think the most exciting things of video games is actually just like saying, no, we don't need that. We don't need to simulate. We can actually abstract things and you create representative things and trust players to actually engage with those and not be like, oh, well, that's not very realistic. That little clock that fills up that represents this, it's just like people don't care. People want stories and they want to have agency. And I think by abstracting mechanics and using things like dice that kind of exist as symbolic objects, you can kind of, there's a huge potential for giving players much more agency and giving like, and then also like taking the weight off having to produce a huge volume of assets that cover every possibility, right? But instead having like systems that work for every possibility, one small but interesting system that works for everything. And certainly that's been a massive thing for Citizen Sleeper, is just that there is basically one mechanic in the entire video game, but that mechanic is used for everything from like building a distillery to like babysitting a child to like fighting a gang enforcer, right? That's the exciting thing about RPGs for me, and I think video games could really learn from that.
Love it. Alfred, same question in reverse.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. I think something that really struck me and inspired me, and Gareth has already touched upon this, is just the simple, subtle influence of like visual elements, especially ones that convey information about stuff time running out or resources running out. So Gareth mentioned about the sort of hunted symbol near the start of the game. Similar things are just the visual representation of having your energy sort of decreasing puts such a pressure on your gameplay that it's almost inconspicuous, but it's there, and it sort of seats itself right in the sort of pit of your stomach in that very sort of primal sense of I need to do something urgently or else something's going to go wrong. And it's interesting that in my playthroughs of Citizen Sleeper, when Gareth had got contacted me, I'd been very much in the throes of this game, like feeling this pressure and not even realizing that there isn't necessarily too much of a punishment for failure in the game, but it makes you think there is, which is a beautiful, it's beautifully done. I think the way you can create tension out of almost nothing, it's a quite a subtle science, I think, and definitely something I think that I keep thinking about this. I'm not sure where I'll take it, but there's definitely stuff there to ponder for tabletop games. This idea of visual cues that really sort of get under the skin, really affects gameplay.
It's interesting. There's I spent the last week out in a cabin in the woods in Tennessee, and I survived hanging out with the Gauntlet Publishing, a bunch of horror writers in a wood cabin in the Smoky Mountains. What could possibly go wrong over the last week? But I played Public Access, which is one of their upcoming Carved from Brindlewood games, and I played Moonlight Vale, which is a like Stardew Valley Carved from Brindlewood inspired emulator, both of which have some heavy elements in them that connect to video games. But one of my favorite moments of the weekend was like I love the mask system from Carved from Brindlewood games. Essentially, if you ever roll poorly, if you roll a 6 on a kind of PBA style move and something bad's going to happen, basically the GM narrates for a little while how horrible this thing is that's going to happen, and at any point you can say, "Oh, I just want to mark a mask to bump that up a level," right? But oftentimes, especially in bad situations, it has the essential reality of your character just got killed. Do you want to, respawn at your last like checkpoint, or do you want to just be done with the game, or sometimes just keep going in spite of this horrible injury you've sustained? But it has very much this, oh shit, I went down the wrong way in this video game, I need to go back to an earlier save point vibe to it. Literally, Jason Cordova at one point while narrating, I totally forgot this mechanic existed and was just like Jason narrating somebody getting killed all of a sudden, and the arterial spray of their brain on one of the other characters' space made me go, holy crap, Jason just killed that person out of nowhere, forgetting that, like, oh, literally the core mechanic is we want you to reset and play this out a different way. Was a really just interesting, like very much getting lost in the narrative, but also a great like video game. No, we're just gonna go back to the last save point moment also too. So I've loved seeing some of the different ways that we don't even think about some of the narrative elements or mechanical elements that we are oftentimes including. And one of the great things about video game tech is it's very player facing, because the video game doesn't have anything emotionally invested in trying to like beat you, right? There's no weird ego elements that come up from GM to player. And solo RPGs do that especially well because the player has to know everything and be interpreting everything constantly. It's a great overlap. Meat Castle wants to know, Alfred, did you ever envision that you'd become one of the go-to people in the space for solo games? Was that a goal or just something that's snowballed out of control in your life?
Yeah, it was my like five-year plan. Absolutely not. I'd refute that that's the case, but people keep coming to me, so I must be doing something right. No, I mean it's just all spurred from curiosity on one side of things, and also not having people around all the time to play games with, right? That's the most fundamental reason you get into solo. And then aside from that, my experience as a board game design, I'd learned what I thought was a secret trick is you can play test something immediately really easily if it's just a one-player game, right? So I can stay in my silo, in my little cave, don't have to go out to the world and bother people. I'm just gonna put my head down. But yeah, I still look back on sort of my path today, and I'm surprised and twists and turns it's taken. But yeah, I'm very much grateful for it.
Gareth, Sword Queen Games Ray wants to know, is there another ttrpg you'd like to draw inspiration from for a future video game?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I will be. Watch this space. Yeah, definitely. I feel like I unlocked a kind of secret, a bit like Alfred saying, you know, like, oh, there's a secret trick. I feel like I unlocked this one neat trick, which is just like there is this incredible volume of interesting design elements to tabletop games, and no one's using them in video games, or very few people are thinking about them, or they're not making the connections. And so I just feel like a kid in the candy shop, just kind of being like, oh, I could have one of these, and I could use this. So now every time I read or play a new tabletop game, I'm always thinking like, what is the video game equivalent of this element? How would this be interesting? Like, I'm not obviously not just trying to kind of like steal them and bring them over, because so often like things just don't work without a GM. Like GMs are the key magical ingredient of any tabletop game. I mean, obviously there are GM-less games, but then really what you're doing is just dispersing the GM's responsibilities among the players. You need people, and so, but video games don't have people in them apart from the player. So that's always the kind of interesting tension for me, is like, how do I bring things across? But yeah, there's loads of stuff. I mean, I'm running a campaign of Heart at the moment. There's lots of stuff I love in Heart. There's stuff in Mothership that I'm also super interested in playing about with. So yeah, I think over time I will definitely be doing more and trying to build on what I've established with Citizen Sleeper.
Awesome. A follow-up question to that: are there other genres or milieus you're currently exploring or thinking about for future games? They said this is from Experiment to Go. They said they would have honestly never expected Citizen Sleeper to be your next after In Other Waters.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm quite a like I get obsessed with things, and then I get obsessed with new things. So my tendency is to just like jump around a bit. I would love to do something in a fantasy space, like a more kind of like traditional fantasy space, but I don't know what that would be. I'd love to do something in like real high space fantasy, kind of like technology that is magic type setup as well. I love people with animal heads. I don't know why, but I just love that, especially if they're wearing a suit or a tuxedo. So something with people who have animal heads at some kind of dinner party, that also sounds good. Yeah, I have a massive stack of ideas that I will die before I finish. So you definitely can expect that I will get through a few different genres on my path through. Yeah.
Love it. I get a strong response in chat also too. People are very excited about your animal-headed suit-wearing simulator.
It's just cool. I don't know why. It's just cool.
Very excited. Awesome. Let's talk really quickly just before we go about In Other Waters. By the way, people, if you have not yet, links in the description, but head on over to ttrpg.link /CitizenSleeperRPG. It's going to take you straight to the funding page. If you have not, like I said, that link's in the description on the video also too. Would love to have you go over, check it out, support the project if you are able. Share it is a great form of support if you've already backed it, or if you are unable to at this time, especially since this game is not running on Kickstarter. It's just running on Lost in Cult's page, which we're huge fans of people stepping outside of normal crowdfunding platforms and doing things on their own. It's great to see one be as successful as this project has been. But yeah, Gareth, tell us a little bit about In Other Waters, what it is, where it's at. I know that I still have to also, I didn't pay my shipping for 1,000 Empty Light. I still have to pay my shipping for Tidebreaker and Other Waters. I'm just that backer who will message you after the campaign's done and be like, oh, can I just pay you shipping now?
Yeah, so I mean, so In Other Words was my first video game, a game about playing as the AI inside the suit of a xenobiologist as they explore and study an alien planet. It's kind of a weird interface game that I think got me involved with also tabletop people, probably led me to tabletop people, because it's a game that's mostly text and maps. And I think that chimed well with the tabletop crowd. And I was approached over a year ago now by Lone Archivist, who makes wonderful mothership modules, about the idea of doing a tabletop module based on the In Other Waters universe. And that's what we did. We ran a Kickstarter for In Other Waters Tidebreak, and it's in its very, very final getting edited and pulled together stages right now. And it kind of, again, tries to port a video game over into a tabletop format, has the most wild tag and AI system for a mothership game, where all the creatures have kind of behavior types, and we use tags to dictate those. And it's kind of weird. It ended up being almost, we joke that it's almost accidentally like we made a tabletop, a whole new tabletop game, and then hid it inside a mothership module. So I hope it's going to be worth the wait. I know people have had to wait a bit for it, but it's been really exciting to work on, and actually is the whole reason that I think I found out about Alfred's work, because when I didn't know mothership at all when I started work on Tidebreak with Lone, and as I worked, I was like, okay, well, I need to learn mothership. And I was like, well, the easiest way is to play a solo version of Mothership. Does that exist? And it didn't, but I kind of like hit into seeing Alfred's solo work and Thousand Empty Light. And I just found it to be incredibly exciting work. So I think it's kind of like part of my journey through has been making Tidebreak. So that will be a next step. It's I think you can still pre-order it now from the Kickstarter page, and it will be out soon. And it's a weird mothership module. It's a science-based mothership module with a lot of studying creatures, but we got a load of dials you can turn up and down. So if you want to turn it into like a struggling against evil creatures thing, you can do that. And there's this kind of like very complex creature behavior stuff that's going on in there that I hope is going to be really interesting for people to run.
Awesome.
It's got a massive map of random encounters, if that's the kind of thing you'd like.
I remember seeing that map as part of the stretch goal on the Kickstarter, and it's just so gorgeous and so invited into that world.
Yeah. And again, has very much this, it's a video game that became a board game / ttrpg, as you now have this giant map / game board. And so no, I've loved getting to chat with y'all. I'm sure we'll get a chance to sit down again with each of you to chat more about your projects in the future. But if people want to follow your work, want to find out more about who you are, Gareth, what's the best place to find you?
So you can find me on Twitter at @JumpOverTheAge. You can find Citizen Sleeper on Twitter at Citizen Sleeper, In Other Waters at In Other Waters. I also have a Substack that I've just started, and I'm getting loads of people over there because that's what I'm kind of doing. So I can never remember which way around it is. I believe it's jumpovertheage.substack.
It's right below your face also too.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, that place is also going to be the place where I love to tease people. There's some weird glitches at the bottom of those emails that people might have noticed. There'll be more of those. I am at heart a GM at all times, so I'm just always introducing mystery clocks for people that follow me. So if you want to check those things out, you will find everything through Twitter. You can also find In Other Waters and Citizen Sleeper on Steam, on Switch, wherever you play your games is probably there. So enjoy those.
Awesome. Alfred, how about you?
Until it implodes, I'm on Twitter at Valley of Alfred. I'm also on TikTok, just Alfred Valley. Tend to do more graphic design stuff there. And I have a site where you can buy stuff, which is houseofvalley.com. That's house, HAUS. I'm currently running a bundle of basically everything I've got available at the moment for a ridiculously low price. If you just try and sell that, if anyone's interested, go head over there. But I'm Alfred Valley in most places apart from Twitter.
Awesome. People really enjoyed the chat. Ray, Experiment to Go, Meat Castle, thanks for bringing us. Kesrick, thanks for the follow. Same to you, Crab Dominion. Anybody else who watches this later on who's followed us in the last couple days, thank you for joining us. We have a lot of different great streams that are happening. We just finished up a 3-part stream of Triangle Agency that I criminally didn't get to play. You can go check that and other past interviews and streams over on our YouTube channel. You can also join us on Discord at ttrpg.link/Discord if you want to discuss content, our games, or other things like that. If you want to support the channel, the best thing to do is go to plus1exp.com. Check out any of our indie games, most of which go to support the creator who made them as the primary place that the money goes. And then we have our house publications and systems as well. You also can pick up bespoke, alchemically powered beard balms, lip balms, and coming soon we'll have lotion bars out. Also, all that stuff helps to go to support the work that we do, get more cool indie games in print, and make let us be able to do more content here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. So head over to plus1exp.com for any or all of that. You can also support us over on Ko-fi. With that said, this has been Prestige Class with the creative team from Citizen Sleeper. And until next time, class is dismissed. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Alfred.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.